The heavy scent of incense mixes with the stench of the Tiber River, carrying whispers of intrigue and violence through the labyrinthine alleys of Rome. Theophylact of Tusculum, a mere boy, possibly as young as 12, watches as his powerful father, Count Alberic III, orchestrates a brutal power grab. Cardinals, their faces etched with fear and ambition, bow low, not to God, but to the powerful Tusculani family that holds Rome in its iron grip. The year is 1032 CE, and a child is about to ascend to the holiest office in Christendom, not through divine calling, but through bribery, intimidation, and the ruthless ambition of his kin. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover the horrifying truth about Pope Benedict IX, a forgotten, scandalous chapter in the history of the Holy See, evidence that chroniclers tried to sanitize for centuries about what really happened behind basilica walls when the papacy became a pawn in a brutal family game. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. This wasn't some isolated anomaly in distant lands. This was Rome. This was the heart of the Christian world. This was the darkest hour of the papacy. And what I'm about to reveal will completely shatter your understanding of how religious authority was seized and wielded by ruthless, secular powers. October 1032 CE, the Lateran Palace echoes with the shouts of armed men, but not in prayer. The powerful Tusculani family is making its move. They're seizing control of the Eternal City, one bloody street fight at a time, just as they had done for previous family members, including Benedict VIII and John XIX. Clerics have been ordered to stay back as the very foundations of the church tremble under the weight of secular ambition. In another wing of the palace, the papal throne stands vacant, its succession already decided by the sword and by gold, not by divine will. The Roman nobility exchanges ruthless glances. The old order is crumbling. A new era of absolute Tusculani control is dawning. They will install a child, Theophylact, and from his first breath as Benedict IX, leader of the church. He's not a spiritual shepherd. He's a dynastic tool. Think about that for a moment. While your biggest worry at 12 might have been school lessons or childhood games, Theophylact was being groomed as the ultimate pawn. His playthings weren't just toys, they were the very levers of Roman power. His upbringing wasn't about piety, it was about political maneuvering. But to understand how a boy, potentially as young as 12, ended up as the supposed Vicar of Christ, we need to expose the rotting core of Roman power during this era, dominated by the Tusculani counts. The Tusculani family, masters of Rome, hadn't always been so brazen, but their power had grown exponentially. For decades, they had consolidated their influence, turning the sacred institutions of Rome into personal fiefdoms. One moment, they were influential nobles. The next, they were installing their own family members into positions of power, from local churches to the highest echelons of the papal administration. The cycles of violence and corruption came in waves. Sometimes a semblance of order would be maintained, as they acted as patrons. Then, without warning, a new rival would emerge, and the streets would run red with blood, or the papal treasury would be plundered, or, worse, the sanctity of religious office would be utterly forgotten in a mire of scandal. Medieval chroniclers, fearful and often complicit, had no answers. They tried everything from eulogizing corrupt figures to outright omitting uncomfortable truths. Nothing worked. Rome was ruled by the Tusculani, and in the shadows, opportunists circled like vultures. Count Alberic III, Theophylact's father, was the chief vulture. Where others saw sacrilege in their actions, he saw opportunity. Every crisis meant more power he could seize, more gold he could hoard, more political alliances he could forge, while the very spirit of the church cowered in its chambers. Wait, it gets worse. The official chroniclers, and remember, these were people often dependent on the very families they wrote about, couldn't even hide their disgust entirely. Ferdinand Gregorovius, a later historian, would write that in Benedict IX, it seemed as if a demon from hell, in the disguise of a priest, occupied the chair of Peter and profaned the sacred mysteries of religion by his insolent courses. Pope Victor III, writing later, would refer to his rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts of violence and sodomy. His life as a pope was so vile, so foul, so execrable that I shudder to think of it. This was the family raising Theophylact. This was his model of leadership. The Lateran palace of Theophylact's childhood was a maze of conspiracies. Factions within the Roman nobility fought for control of the city. Assassination attempts were common. Poison was a constant fear. Noble children didn't play in tranquil gardens. They played in fortified courtyards with guards watching for assassins. Theophylact learned to recognize the signs of an impending coup before he learned his catechism. The way the whispers intensified, the sudden disappearances of rivals, the chilling silence that meant a new power was consolidating its grip. He was a young boy when he first witnessed the brutal realities of Roman power struggles. But here's the detail historians don't want you to know. The papal archives, though often purged, contained chilling entries that alluded to this period. Hidden in those dusty scrolls are disturbing records. In 1032 CE, when Theophylact was perhaps as young as 12, records show vast sums were openly spent by his father to secure key Roman strongholds and buy votes not for defense against outside threats, but because the Tusculani family was preparing to install a minor as the supreme pontiff. Even at that age, the path to power seemed to justify any means. The childhood of privilege was just preparation for what was coming. In 1032 CE, Count Alberic III decided the time was ripe for his ultimate move. He effectively controlled Rome. His goal, to solidify his dynasty's grip on the city and the papacy for generations. The Sacred College, intimidated and fractured, saw an opportunity to appease the strongest power in Rome, all for the price of one boy, Theophylact. The negotiations for his ascent are where this story turns from political intrigue to truly monstrous. Imagine these grown men in rich vestments sitting around mahogany tables, haggling over the future of Christendom like merchants at a slave market. The foreign envoys initially balked at Theophylact's age. Even by the standards of the time, 12, or even 20 as some suggest, was shockingly young for such a sacred office. Most spiritual leaders were mature men, learned in theology, and seasoned in leadership. But the Tusculani had a counter-argument that should chill you to your core. They explained that installing Theophylact young meant he could be shaped entirely to their preferences. He would grow up knowing only their will, only their customs, only their desires. He would be, in their words, more completely theirs. They were talking about indoctrination, state-sanctioned, religiously sanctioned indoctrination of a mere child. They wanted Theophylact to be presented first. That's right, presented like a prize. Roman courtiers were ordered to parade the boy before the influential families. They examined his lineage, his demeanor, his apparent intelligence. They made him recite Latin phrases to ensure he possessed a basic education. One noble was overheard commenting that he would be perfectly malleable. He was a boy in his early youth. The final deal was struck in October 1032 CE. The Tusculani would solidify their control over the city, ensuring wealth and protection. In exchange, Theophylact would be elevated as Pope Benedict IX, granting them unprecedented influence over religious and political affairs. But they saved the cruelest detail for last. Contemporary accounts, often written by hostile but plausible sources, contain details that modern historians often gloss over. They describe how, while the spiritual duties would eventually be his, Benedict IX would immediately exercise all other rights of a sovereign. What were those rights? The right to control immense wealth, to wield military power, to dictate policy, the right to engage in scandalous behaviors, because Roman nobility of that era believed young rulers should grow accustomed to their power and its accompanying vices, the right to absolute authority over every aspect of his existence. They signed away his innocence with a stroke of a quill. When they told Theophylact he was to become Pope Benedict IX, he was likely more concerned with his aristocratic pleasures than with spiritual duties. Think about that. A boy's primary interests were likely still those of a privileged youth, Yet he was thrust into the highest office in Christendom. The Tusculani family threw itself into Benedict IX's elevation with obscene enthusiasm. Priests and nobles worked day and night preparing for the ceremony. New vestments, lavish banquets, jewels that had belonged to generations of rulers, all to adorn a young boy. His father, Count Alberic III, personally oversaw the preparations, showing more interest in his son's ascension than he'd shown in his entire upbringing. Why? Because this was his triumph. He'd successfully traded a child for absolute power and profit. The court poets composed verses praising his family's wisdom. No one wrote verses for the child being packaged for sacred office. October 1032 CE, the enthronement ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica was a masterpiece of political theatre. Count Alberic III, in a rare moment of public display, embraced his son with feigned reverence. Witnesses described the spectacle. We'll never know precisely what his father whispered in his ear, but the atmosphere was one of triumphant ambition, not spiritual devotion. The journey from his family palace to the papal throne took mere minutes, but it was a journey of a child pushed further and further into a world he was ill-equipped to handle. His later actions suggest he barely cared for spiritual matters, preferring the chase, the revelry. In the basilica, the ritual took place like a coronation, which, if we're honest, it was. The Roman clergy had gathered in massive numbers. Silk vestments stretched as far as the eye could see, each bearing the symbols of power. Musicians played. Incense filled the air. It was a festive atmosphere, everyone celebrating except the young man at the center of it all. The moment of transfer was precisely choreographed. Roman nobles escorted Theophylact to the exact center of the vast basilica. Senior cardinals met him there. Words were spoken in Latin, words Benedict IX. Still a youth, only partially understood. Oaths were sworn, power changed hands, and just like that, he belonged to the church, or rather, to his family's control of the church. But what happened next is where the sanitized version of history falls apart completely. The new Pope Benedict IX's advisors immediately surrounded him, separating him from any true mentors. His childhood tutors, who tried to instill some semblance of religious learning, were likely dismissed or sidelined. His personal servants were replaced with those loyal to his family, who spoke only of power and wealth. Even his youthful companions, the few friends he had, were probably either corrupted or sent away because his family deemed them distractions. They stripped away any vestiges of a normal childhood in the span of an hour. The early days of his pontificate were a blur of strange faces and incomprehensible duties. The Roman elite tried to make it festive. Every public appearance was ordered to celebrate their new leader. But imagine being a young man, overwhelmed and thrust into a role of immense spiritual and temporal power, with strangers screaming your new title in a foreign tongue while bells ring and crowds press in from all sides. He later proved to be more of a secular ruler than a spiritual one, engaging in excesses. He wasn't entirely wrong to see himself as a figurehead of power. Rome, October 1032 CE. The city had never seen a spectacle quite like this. Count Alberic III had spent a fortune he didn't have to impress his subjects and intimidate his enemies. The Lateran Palace was draped in rich tapestries. The streets were crowded with cheering throngs. Every church bell in the city rang from dawn to midnight. St. Peter's Basilica had been transformed into something from a fever dream. Thousands of candles, incense so thick it made eyes water, banners showing the combined arms of the Tusculani and the papacy, an altar covered in enough gold to buy a small army, and at the center of it all, a young man, Benedict IX, waiting to assume the holiest office. Benedict IX cut an impressive figure in his elaborate robes, but his features were those of a youth, not a seasoned cleric. By all accounts, the scene was dominated by the Tusculani. His father wasn't nervous about installing a family member, he was nervous about the politics. Would this buy him enough time to crush his domestic enemies? Would the Holy Roman Emperor accept this blatant power grab? Would the other Roman nobles accept a pontiff who would embody their family's dominance for years? The moral implications didn't seem to cross their minds when they brought Benedict IX into the basilica. The crowd might have gasped, not in admiration, but in shock at his youth and the brazenness of his ascent. The ceremonial robes dragged behind him, requiring attendants to carry the train. The mitre, perhaps specially made for his youthful head, might still have seemed oversized. He was led, or more accurately, paraded, down that impossibly long aisle. Hundreds of nobles watched. Ambassadors from across Europe took notes. And at the altar, his family's ambitions waited with the patience of a spider. The most senior cardinal performed the ceremony. He had to adjust his posture to consecrate Benedict. When he was asked if he consented to the election, he assented. The required words were spoken, and Benedict repeated them, in a voice perhaps still unaccustomed to the weight of such an office. "I consent." 2 words that sentenced him to a lifetime of scandal and manipulation. When it came time for the ring, the cardinal's hand completely engulfed Benedict's. Witnesses might have noted his youth. The ring, despite being specially made, still symbolized an immense burden. He bore the weight of the papacy. No one stopped the ceremony. The solemn blessing, a traditional part of the medieval enthronement, was performed, symbolizing the spiritual authority now vested in him, however bought, and then it was done. Benedict IX was now the head of the Christian world, the supreme pontiff, a young man elevated to an adult's world of power and vice. The crowd cheered, bells rang, coins were thrown to the poor in celebration. Meanwhile, a young man stood at the altar, his future now irrevocably tied to the very forces that put him there. The coronation feast was held at the Lateran Palace. Thousands of guests ate courses that would have fed entire villages for months. Roasted game, exotic fruits, wines from across the known world. Entertainment included musicians, jesters, and even reports of scandalously themed performances. Benedict IX sat at the high table in a chair specially built to raise him to adult height. He was likely immersed in the revelry, not the sanctity. A sympathetic cardinal, seated nearby, later wrote of the moral decay. But the real horror was yet to come. Papal enthronements were followed by lavish banquets, but under Benedict IX, they often descended into unparalleled corruption. He allegedly lived a life of unrestrained indulgence, surrounded by sycophants and mercenaries. He was accused of throwing wild parties, turning the Lateran into a brothel, and even committing acts of violence. What happened next? We know from the outraged accounts of foreign observers and later historians. Benedict IX, raised in corruption, quickly embraced his unearned power with unholy zeal. He lived a life of unrestrained indulgence, being accused of rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts of violence and sodomy. He showered his allies with gifts not relics or theological texts, but titles, gold, and positions of power. Was this youthful rebellion? Or was this the logical conclusion of unchecked power in the hands of a spoiled noble? Historians still debate. What we know is that Benedict IX became infamous. He excommunicated rivals, participated in military campaigns, and was widely accused of heinous crimes. He violently punished anyone who showed him disrespect. But don't mistake this for a coming-of-age story. A corrupt pope is still corrupt, a violent leader is still violent, and a sacred office desecrated by such a figure is still desecrated. Life at the Roman court settled into a bizarre routine. Benedict IX attended state functions where he was displayed like an unholy relic. Foreign ambassadors would comment on how brazen he was, how he openly defied moral authority and engaged in scandalous behavior. I've got 3 more shocking revelations coming up about what happened to the papacy during this dark age, and how Benedict IX's actions led to a crisis of legitimacy. But before we continue, if you're finding this hidden history as disturbing as I did when I uncovered it, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. I release new investigations every week, exposing the dark truths about historical figures. And trust me, Benedict IX's story is just the beginning of what the history books don't want you to know. No one mentioned that perhaps he still harbored childish fears in private, that he still had nightmares that made him scream for the guidance he never truly received. His close circle certainly did not temper his excesses. The Roman nobles were divided in their treatment of him, some seeing which way the political winds blew fawned over the young pontiff, while others, resentful of the Tusculani influence and the rampant corruption that was bankrupting the church, treated him with barely concealed contempt. One incident recorded by a chronicler, but often omitted from sanitized histories, shows the daily horror of Benedict IX's pontificate. During a public procession in 1044, opposition to his dissolute lifestyle forced him out of the city. He returned, only to be driven out again later that year by the Romans who elected Sylvester III as Pope. Benedict IX, however, soon regained power. This was a pattern. He would be deposed, regain the papacy, only to create more scandal. He didn't stop the culture that made such actions possible. Meanwhile, across Europe, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Holy Roman Empire was in disarray, competing factions vied for power, and the church spiraled towards a new low. The vast wealth of the church, meant to secure its spiritual authority, was spent rapidly on Benedict IX's lavish lifestyle and failed political endeavors. He likely received letters from pious bishops, heavily censored by his inner circle, urging reform. He might have dismissed them, consumed by his own power. Then, in 1045, everything changed. In a truly unprecedented act, and allegedly wishing to marry his cousin, Benedict IX sold the papacy to his godfather, a pious priest named John Gratian, who became Pope Gregory VI. He literally traded the highest office in Christendom for a large sum of money to reimburse his election expenses and fund his personal life. But think about what this meant for the church. It had three claimants to the papacy: Benedict IX, Sylvester III, and now Gregory VI. This chaotic situation led Emperor Henry III to intervene. At the Council of Sutri in December 1046, all three were deposed, and a new reforming pope, Clement II, was elected. But Benedict IX was not easily removed. Upon Clement II's death in 1047, Benedict seized the Lateran Palace, once again reclaiming the papacy for a third time. He was driven out by German troops in July 1048. His eventual fate is obscure. He seems to have given up his claims to the papal throne. He is traditionally believed to have lived until 1055 or 1056, possibly dying as a penitent at the monastery of Grottaferrata. His final years were not a triumphant return. He was removed from power, from the city, from history. For a brief moment, Rome might have believed the nightmare was over. It was wrong. The nightmare was just changing shape. Rome in the mid-11th century was still chaotic. The struggle for the papacy continued. The city changed hands regularly, each faction bloodier than the last. The papacy, though now under reform-minded popes due to imperial intervention, still bore the scars of Benedict IX's reign. His family's influence eventually waned, and the papacy began a period of reform that would fundamentally change how popes were elected and how the church was governed. But this is Benedict IX's story, and his legacy was one of profound corruption. He died around 1055 or 1056, barely in his 40 as a pope 3 times over, a symbol of moral decay, and finally, perhaps, a penitent. The chroniclers spent considerable effort detailing his infamy chroniclers like Victor III, Peter Damian, and Ferdinand Gregorovius, whose accounts, while potentially biased, paint a damning picture. They focused on the political and moral implications of his life, and the human tragedy of an institution profaned. We know the truth now, hidden in historical records, in the outrage of moral observers, in the margins of official histories where scribes sometimes told the truth. We know what was done by Benedict IX, and what was allowed to be done to the papacy. He was not a pious shepherd. He was a child of powerful ambition, sacrificed on the altar of secular power. His reign was not holy or meaningful. It was preventable corruption dressed up in sacred vestments and called authority. Every time we romanticize the medieval period, every time we sigh over knights and ladies and the grandeur of the church, we're erasing uncomfortable truths. children thrust into impossible roles, sacred institutions that are traded like commodities, human beings whose very spiritual well-being was subordinated to the games of powerful men. The proof is overwhelming: the records of his election, the accounts of his scandalous reign, the multiple depositions, the infamous sale of the papacy. This was not an anomaly, but a symptom of a systemic illness in the church of that era. Benedict IX's story, while extreme, reflects a period where powerful families routinely controlled the papacy. Young men, often related to previous popes, were installed for political gain. He stands for all of them, all the children propelled into positions of power beyond their years, and for the deep need for reform that would eventually reshape the church. When you see medieval romances on screen, remember Pope Benedict IX, his reign of debauchery and the sale of the papacy. When historians talk about the glory of the medieval church, remember a young man, possibly just 12 years old, thrust into the papal throne by his family's influence. When people romanticize powerful dynasties as different times, remember a life consumed by unchecked power and moral decay. Pope Benedict IX was a product of his time, a period where the sacred was profaned by politics. His spiritual purity was murdered at his election, his moral authority was murdered by his actions, his legitimate claim was murdered by his simony, and his influence finally faded by the time of his death. He left behind a legacy that would haunt the papacy for centuries, prompting a much-needed period of reform that would eventually break the hold of Roman aristocratic families. The cycle of corruption continued because that's what cycles do when no one stops them. But we can stop romanticizing them. We can call them what they were: child exploitation sanctioned by powerful families, spiritual authority treated as a commodity, the destruction of integrity in the name of power. The next time someone tells you about the romance of medieval times, tell them about Benedict IX. Tell them about the young man who became pope through bribery. Tell them about the scandals that shocked Europe. Tell them about the ultimate act of simony, when he sold the papacy. That's the real medieval period. That's the truth behind the cassocks and crowns. That's the horror we've spent centuries trying to forget. But Benedict IX deserves to be remembered, not as a holy figure, not as a symbol of glory, but as a chilling example of a world that saw the holiest office as property. He was a young man, possibly just 12 years old, when he became pope, and his story is a stark reminder of unchecked power. That's the horror that should haunt us, not ghosts or monsters or things that go bump in the night, but the real horror of real people doing unconscionable things and calling it divine right. Benedict IX, remember his name, remember his story, and remember that the only thing necessary for such evil to flourish is for good people to look away and call it history. His tumultuous reign and the dark period he represents deserve at least that much. If Benedict IX's story shocked you, you need to see what happened to other historical figures who manipulated power for their own gain. I've uncovered other suppressed historical truths. Subscribe for more investigations, and I'll see you in the next one.